Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Age of Empires: The Age of Kings for Nintendo DS. Now you may be thinking to yourself, wait. Age of Empires on Nintendo DS. But it is actually a thing. This was developed by Backbone Entertainment and published by Majesco in 2006, and it was pretty decently received overall, although some people did complain about certain technical issues that would cause the game to freeze up and sometimes corrupt save data. Although it is worth noting that I've had a copy of this since I got my DS, and while my DS screen has started to give me some problems, this game never has. I've not run into a single major technical problem, with really the only technical issues I've been running into at all being things like some slowdown when there's a lot of units on screen at once on a large map, or maybe some graphics glitches here and there that you barely notice. But while I never ran into any major technical issues, obviously there was enough of a problem to where there were some warnings put out about it and certain workarounds were put into place. So who knows, maybe it's an issue with specific DS consoles, maybe it's an issue with specific region versions, I don't know. At any rate, the game attempts to translate the real-time strategy experience of Age of Empires 2: The Age of Kings on PC to a turn-based strategy game on the Nintendo DS. It's a pretty wild departure when you think about it, but it also makes a lot of sense for a handheld, where the limited power and screen real estate as well as the lessened ability to make quick tactical movements makes real-time strategy a lot more difficult to pull off. But while we'll be taking a look at the translation of real-time strategy in the absolute classic Age of Empires 2 to the turn-based strategy of the DS version later on, it is worth noting before we begin that ultimately the game seems to have sold well enough to spur development of a sequel, although it would be under a different development house and a different publisher by that point because Majesco was running into financial problems at that point. And that game would ultimately become Age of Empires Mythologies, which, as it sounds, is basically an attempt to take Age of Mythology and translate that to a DS game. Of course, I'll be taking a look at that one in a different video, and it'll probably be quite a while before I get to that one because I actually haven't had Age of Empires Mythologies for all that long, at least certainly not compared to Age of Kings, because I've had Age of Kings since I got my DS, and I picked up a copy of Age of Empires Mythologies when I was in Germany for a while, but I just haven't really messed around with it all that much yet. Age of Kings, on the other hand, I've played quite a lot of, so let's go ahead and start delving right into this and find out what exactly we're dealing with here, how it stacks up to Age of Empires 2, bearing of course in mind the severe limitations of this handheld versus of course PC, and we'll find out how well the real-time strategy greatness of Age of Empires 2 translates to a turn-based system. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which is a bit of a mixed bag. The UI on one hand is actually very clean and easy to work with and styled very nicely for a medieval strategy game, and the maps are a rather nice 2D isometric art style that's bright and colorful and also just looks quite nice in general. And of course there are the character graphics that you'll see in all the menus and the various dialogue boxes that come up, which are similarly bright and colorful, but they are considerably more cartoony than some of the other visuals here, which puts them a bit at odds with certain other graphics in the interface and such. And even more importantly, they're also at odds with the actual unit graphics, where the units on the maps themselves look fine, but then it shows you the 3D models in the unit display as well as the battle displays, and they look absolutely hideous. And you may be thinking to yourself, well, obviously they're going to be ugly models, DW. The resolution on the DS screen is minuscule, and those screens are absolutely tiny. Well, the problem there is that they somehow managed to make those 3D models look absolutely terrible even on such a small screen at such a low resolution. And while the DS is certainly not capable of masterful 3D graphics by any stretch of the imagination, it was certainly capable of a lot better than that. I mean, sure, some of the units look fine, but then there are things like the archers, which are carrying around these absolutely gigantic bows that are almost as thick as they are. It looks absurd. Frankly, it would have looked a lot better if they hadn't tried to use 3D models. If they just stuck with sprites, it would have been perfectly fine, but unfortunately they decided not to do that, and that does unfortunately drag the visuals down a bit. But there is a considerably bigger problem that you'll be running into, and that is that when there's a lot of units in a small area, it can become very difficult to tell what's going on. Because of the isometric perspective, a lot of times the units will overlap with each other and you just end up with this big cluster of pixely mess that's just hard to figure out. Thankfully, the game is turn-based, so it's not as big of a problem as it would be, say, if this were a real-time strategy game instead, and you do have time to take the cursor around the area and see exactly what units are what. But it is still an issue, and one that is considerably more of a problem than just the 3D models looking ugly. So the visuals are kinda all over the place, but then you move over into sound design and things are considerably more consistent. When you select and move units around, they do respond with actual voiced lines that are basically just copy-pasted from their respective cultures in Age of Empires 2, albeit with lower audio quality because this is a handheld with rather limited resources, and while the audio quality is not bad, it is noticeably weaker than that of Age of Empires 2. Again, that's not really surprising given the handheld platform, but it is something to be aware of. It is also worth noting that the voice clips only play when you select and move units around. There's no voice acting for any of the campaign dialogue, most likely because there just isn't enough space on the cartridge for all of those on top of all the other stuff that's in the game. But if you're coming from Age of Empires 2 on PC, where all of those lines are voiced, it is a bit of a downgrade. Of course, if you're coming off of other DS games, then that's pretty normal, so it's not really going to bother you at all. Anyway, moving on from the voice clips, the sound effects themselves are all adequate. They do their job well enough, but aren't particularly impressive in any one regard. And of course, you do have the audio quality issues like with the voice clips, but it's, again, reasonable considering the platform. But then there's the music, where the only recognizable track, if you're a fan of Age of Empires anyway, is the opening theme, which is just a heavily crushed version of the opening theme from Age of Empires 2. And there's nothing really wrong with that particular track, but it gets your hopes up for the rest of the soundtrack, because in case you aren't aware, the soundtrack in Age of Empires 2, and also Age of Empires 1 for that matter, is downright iconic. It is an absolutely fantastic soundtrack, and when you get to Age of Empires on the DS, you get the opening theme, and then you get one very brief loop for every single faction in the game. This means there's about a grand total of 6 tracks in the entire game, although you can count more if you count the incidental things like for events or winning or losing a mission or things like that, but those are stingers, they're not really music per se. And while there's nothing inherently bad about the 6 musical tracks that this does have, unfortunately because there's so few tracks and they are so short in terms of their loops, and they are so incredibly repetitive, you're gonna get sick of it pretty quick. It certainly doesn't help that those loops will actually reset whenever the turn passes over to a given faction. So let's say you're playing the Franks and you're going up against the Britons. Well, it's going to be playing the Frankish track whenever you're taking your turn, and then immediately when it switches over to the Britons' turn, it starts playing their track, and then it switches back over to your turn, and you get your Frankish track again, and it's just going to keep going back and forth until eventually the match ends. Obviously, if your game has additional factions in it, then it will also play their themes whenever they're taking their turns, so you're getting a bit of a weird mishmash of these themes, and it just doesn't work very well. So that ends up being a rather disappointing mark against the sound design, but when you bring the entire presentation together, it mostly just ends up being functional, and that's really all it needs to be. I mean, this is a strategy game, it's not like we're expecting masterpiece visuals here, but the unit clumping and the 3D visuals being so hideous are certainly problems, and of course the sound design, it just ends up being a bit of a mess overall. But here's the thing, as messy as the presentation can be, what really matter here are the story, or in this case mostly lack thereof, and the gameplay. The story in this is really much the same as the story of Age of Empires 2: The Age of Kings on PC, in that there are several campaigns that are meant to follow the exploits of a historical figure associated with a given faction, and you'll be given a sequence of levels that you have to complete one after the other in order to unlock the next one, and they'll have some objectives that you need to complete in there, along with some bonus objectives that you can complete for extra points. Most of the campaigns campaign levels in this were adapted somewhat from campaign levels in Age of Empires 2 on PC, but whenever they're adapting a level from the Age of Kings on PC, they take some liberties with it and change things up to fit the gameplay style of the Age of Kings on DS. In this particular game, your tutorial campaign is Joan of Arc as opposed to the Age of Kings on PC, where Joan of Arc was actually the second campaign and the tutorial campaign was the William Wallace campaign where you played as the Celts. Here, there are only 5 factions. You have the Britons, the Franks, the Saracens, the Mongols, and the Japanese. Although there are actually certain units that you can get as mercenaries that were the special units for some of the other factions in the PC version, like, for example, Janissaries, or Viking Berserkers, or Celtic Woad Raiders. And the campaigns, respectively, are the Joan of Arc campaign for the Franks, where it is the tutorial and it's mostly just adapted from the same one that was on the PC, the Richard the Lionheart Britain campaign, the Saracen campaign where you follow the exploits of Saladin, the Japanese campaign where you play as Minamoto Yoshitsune, and finally the Mongol campaign where you play as Genghis Khan. You can go about any of these campaigns in whatever order you wish, but in order to get to the next level in the campaign, you do have to complete the prior level in it, and they have set up each of the campaigns to be a certain stacking difficulty. So, for example, at the very bottom of difficulty you have the tutorial, and then after that you have the Japanese campaign, followed by the Mongols, and then the Saracens, and then finally the Britons. Obviously, some of the levels within the campaigns are going to be more or less difficult than others, but by and large, they're a pretty decent challenge, all things considered. It's just that a lot of the reason that they end up being difficult isn't necessarily because they are a legitimate challenge, but because the game very heavily stacks the deck against you. And by that I mean that you'll go into a scenario and it will clump a lot of very powerful units together, so you end up having to go through an absolute slog to get through them, but when you take out those enemies, they're either on or very nearby their spawning structures, so they're constantly getting new supplies of units, and it just ends up being a battle of attrition more than anything else. It also doesn't help that in some of these campaigns they will be throwing a lot of special units at you which have unique qualities to them and are very, very powerful. And so you'll have to find a way to try to counter those with the often rather weak units that are at your disposal. This can make certain campaign levels fairly frustrating, so you need to be prepared to be patient with this thing when you go into it, and you also need to expect that there's not going to be much in the way of story other than some basic context for why you're doing what you're doing in these given campaign levels. And because of the severe lack of story, you might as well just think of the campaign levels as challenge maps more than anything else, because that's basically what they are. And while that does definitely mean that there's a missed opportunity for making the campaign something more meaningful, it is certainly fitting given the nature of this particular game. And this does ultimately lead me into the gameplay, even though I have sort of been talking about that already with the campaigns, because again, I've barely said anything about story because there really isn't any. I've said more about the setups for them and how they work. And that is simply because this is a game that is entirely about its gameplay more than anything else. So how does this work? First off, how does it adapt the real-time strategy mechanics of Age of Empires 2 on PC to a handheld platform in a turn-based format? Well, for one, it dramatically simplifies the economy. No longer are you using 4 resources like you did in Age of Empires 1 and 2 on PC, or even 3 resources like you do in Age of Empires 3. It now only uses 2 resources, which are food and gold, and you're going to be using these to train units, build buildings, and research tech. And unlike in other Age of Empires games where you need to have villagers working those particular resources in order to get a stream of them, and they are finite, in this one the resources are infinite and they generate on a per turn basis based on the number of mills and mines that you have, and the mills can be upgraded by putting additional farm plots around them. In addition, there are also relics scattered around the maps that you can send monks to collect and bring back to churches in order to generate a small amount of both food and gold instead of just the gold like they would generate in Age of Empires 2. On top of this, in the skirmish mode in particular, you'll also notice that there are certain things scattered around the maps that you can collect by sending units over to just stop on that particular tile. And these will be goats, bags of gold, and ruins. If you go on bags of gold, you get 100 gold. If you go on the goats, you get 100 food. And if you go on to the ruins, then a random effect occurs, which can be either getting 100 food or 100 gold, or it can give you a free unit, or a free tech, or it can just kill the unit that stopped on it. And it doesn't matter what unit that is, so if your hero happened to be the one that stepped on it and it ended up getting that particular event, then you've lost your hero for the rest of the game. So you learn pretty quickly only to send cheap and expendable units to the ruins. As you explore, you will find new points where you can build mills and mines, which are going to be wheat fields and gold deposits respectively, and since there are only a limited number of these positions on the maps, controlling them is extremely important. Much like with Age of Empires 2 on PC, if you can deprive the enemy of resources while maximizing yours, then you will be able to overwhelm them and win. Much like the PC game this is derived from, you have a variety of units at your disposal to dispatch your foes, each of which has their own strengths and weaknesses. For example, infantry is strong against buildings and siege weapons. Meanwhile, cavalry is strong against infantry and ranged units, but is weak against buildings. So you need to make sure you have a good selection of units from a variety of types available to you to fit whatever situation is at hand. For example, if the enemy has a bunch of pikemen, you're not going to want to send your cavalry in there because those guys actually have a bonus against cavalry and they'll tear your cavalry apart. You'll want to send infantry or archers in there instead because they'll just tear the pikemen up like they're made of tissue paper. But of course, in order to have these units, you need to build the structures that can train them first. And in order to do that, you're going to need a town center. You can put a town center just about anywhere on the map, and then you can build structures up around it. This is a pretty major departure from the gameplay style we saw in the PC version, because in that you could just build buildings wherever you wanted to on the map as long as there was a level ground for it and there was enough space. In the DS game, on the other hand, whenever you build a town center, there are 4 building slots in the tiles immediately adjacent to it, and you can build various town structures in these slots. So these can be things like barracks, which trains infantry, or an archery range, which trains ranged units, or a stable that trains cavalry, or even things that just advance your technology like a university or a blacksmith. And there's even a multi-role structure in the form of a market, which unlike in the PC version, is not simply a commerce building where you can send units back and forth to generate money from. In this, it does affect the trade rate, which is the amount of either food or gold that you need to pay in order to get 100 of the other resource. But it also allows you to hire a mercenary unit, which is a unit taken from a selection of 3 units per turn, which are randomized every turn, and you do have to pay more gold than you normally would for that particular unit, but you'll have access to more than just the general selection of units that everybody has access to. You'll even get access to special units that you can't get anywhere else, like Knights Templar or Woad Raiders. Those units can be extremely powerful, so you might want to have some of them in your arsenal when you go to conquer everybody. At any given building, you can only train 1 unit per turn, and that unit will become active at the beginning of the next turn. You do need to be careful with this, because until that next turn, that unit only has half of their health. So if they get attacked by an enemy unit while they're still in the process of training, they can get wiped out very easily. And of course, if they manage to survive that, then the next turn when they become active, they'll still have a very low amount of health. Of course, you can also use that to your advantage, because as long as there's a unit on any given structure, the enemy units cannot attack that structure until that unit is destroyed. So it can make for a good delaying tactic if you're waiting on the rest of your units from across the map to get to wherever you need to go, or whatever the case may be. And speaking of tactics, one of the particularly interesting ones they introduced in this as part of the whole town structure system is that you can destroy an enemy's town center, and the structures that were tower around it will still remain standing, and you can just build a town center where theirs once stood, and you'll gain access to all of the town structures that were built up around that previous town center. In fact, you can do the same exact thing with the mills, because mills have farms around them, and if you destroy the mill structure in the middle of them and build a mill where that once stood, then you'll immediately gain access to all the farms that are still standing around that. This gives you some incentive to be careful about what you destroy versus what you leave standing, because if you manage to destroy the enemy town center, then you have an opportunity to create a forward base that's right near where the enemy is. And if you want to reinforce your position, then that's what the 4 diagonal spaces around the town center are for. You can use those to construct towers, which will grant defensive bonuses, although unfortunately, unlike in the PC game, they do not attack nearby enemies, nor do castles for that matter. Now, the only mechanic that carries over from the PC game for castles is that it allows you to construct your special unit, which is a unit that is specific to each individual faction. For example, the Britons get longbowmen, whereas the Franks get throwing axemen. All of these special units are very powerful in their own ways, and you can only gain access to them once you hit the castle age and build a castle somewhere. There are also some additional units that you have to unlock through research once you get to the Imperial Age, those being paladins, champions, and of course gunpowder units. Going up to the next age in this works a bit differently than it does in the PC game, whereas in the PC game all you had to do was have the requisite amount of resources and the requisite amount of structures of the given age that you're currently in. In the DS game, you need both the amount of resources and the requisite amount of current technology. So, for example, with going up to the Feudal Age, you need at least 3 Dark Age techs, and once you've done that, then you need to have the right amount of resources before you can go up to the Feudal Age. When you go from Feudal to Castle, you need 7 of the techs from the Feudal Age, and finally, to go up to the Imperial Age, you need 11 of the techs from the Castle Age. Like with the PC games, going up to the next age unlocks additional unit types as well as upgraded versions of the units you already have, and it also unlocks new buildings and new technologies. Most of the technologies in this are directly related to making your units more powerful, so giving them additional attack power or defense power, or maybe increasing line of sight or movement rate. There are also a few techs that will bump up your economy by improving the amount of food and gold that you get from the resource structures, as well as improving the trade rate, and eventually you'll gain access to techs that just unlock new units entirely. It's certainly a lot less tech than what you'll see in the PC game, but it does make sense that they would only go for things that focus on the gameplay mechanics that they are trying to go for. They're not able to replicate the exact gameplay of Age of Empires 2 on PC, so they took most of the elements from it and implemented them in a turn-based strategy game here, and for the most part it actually works out pretty well. They even implemented a few things of their own with the Empire point system, where you can spend the points that you earn from completing the campaign levels and the additional objectives that you'll have in those, as well as just winning skirmish matches, to unlock additional special units like Genoese crossbowmen or Swiss pikemen, which are basically slightly upgraded versions of standard units, or you can use them to unlock additional map types for the skirmish mode. They even implemented a sort of skill system where certain units have access to certain skills, like First Strike, which allows them to attack first no matter what, unless of course the unit they're attacking or defending against has First Strike themselves, or the Anti-Cavalry skill, which gives a massive bonus against cavalry both on attack and defense, or Frenzy, which allows a unit that has lost health and would normally attack or defend at a reduced strength to attack with whatever the strength it would have had at full health was. And in doing all of that, they've managed to make Age of Empires: The Age of Kings on Nintendo DS stand on its own as an actual standalone game, on top of being a fairly faithful adaptation of the classic real-time strategy gameplay we're used to in a system that works a lot better on handhelds in turn-based mode. But then there's the moments where the game is not firing on all cylinders, and that is most of the time you're going to be playing the skirmish mode, because the AI in this game is incredibly stupid. Obviously, if you're playing against easy AI, it is a complete pushover that requires absolutely no effort. If you're playing on medium, it is still incredibly easy and requires basically no effort. The only difficulty setting that offers even the slightest hint of challenge is the hard mode, and even going up against hard AI, they generally just bumble their way around the map and make incredibly boneheaded decisions, like not attacking your units when they're standing right next to theirs, and as such it becomes incredibly easy to curb stomp the AI. This is less of an issue in the campaigns because the enemy AI in that basically cheats. They usually have access to structures that allow them to create units right from the get-go, and sometimes they'll even have access to particularly powerful special units. But giving the enemy AI a head start isn't exactly the most fair way of implementing challenge, and it does end up making the campaigns feel a bit cheap in their difficulty. And as I mentioned before, this can ultimately result in some battles of attrition where you're just having to force yourself through a slog of enemies that just constantly seem to keep respawning, and there's not a whole lot you can do about it other than keep spawning units of your own and just go at it until eventually they run out of units. And that unfortunately makes the game a fairly mixed bag. It does have a multiplayer mode, and you can play at hot seat, which means that you're all playing on the same console, but the real draw would have been to try to play the multiplayer over Wi-Fi, which you can't really do anymore. Now admittedly in my case, the DS Wi-Fi feature never seemed to work to begin with. I'm not sure if it was something with my network settings or if there was something wrong with my DS itself, but I only ever managed to get the Wi-Fi connection on it working once, and all I was able to do with that was play some Ultimate Mortal Kombat online. And that was a pretty miserable experience because it was extremely laggy. You can't really do the same thing with Age of Empires on the DS. It's really more of a local Wi-Fi connection, but unfortunately I really can't say for sure how it would perform over the Wi-Fi because I just can't get it working anymore. But even without being able to do much of anything with the multiplayer functionality in this, except for of course hot seat play, there's still a pretty good amount of content on offer here, and like I said before, when everything's firing on all cylinders, this actually does a pretty good job of being a turn-based implementation of Age of Empires-like gameplay. It's definitely nowhere near the same, and I would infinitely recommend Age of Empires 2 on PC well over this any day. But if you have a Nintendo DS and you're looking for a turn-based strategy game, you could do a hell of a lot worse than this. And it generally being a fairly competent attempt at transferring the real-time strategy gameplay style of Age of Empires 2 on PC to the DS ultimately nets it a 3 out of 5. Obviously you're not going to want to pick this up unless you can get it for cheap, and obviously I would not recommend going out of your way to pick up a copy of it. But if you see a copy of Age of Empires: The Age of Kings for DS on the shelf and it's on sale for a fairly cheap price, it might be worth looking into. Thank you all very much for watching, and if you like the kind of videos I make, then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Every single cent I get from that goes directly back into the channel, whether that be getting additional games for review, or getting additional equipment, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine, I understand, but the option is there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.